So, what I'd like to talk about right now is something called use source positions. And it's very important that you know about this when you're working with sub-D objects. And basically, it's going to feel like we're kind of starting backwards, but the reason why I'm bringing it up now is so that you're thinking about it once you hit the end of your project. But I kind of like to go through it a little bit because we were talking about polygonal versus sub-D objects. So, I mean, it's always important to properly import an object, but it's also just as important how you export an object going out. A simple polygonal object is somewhat easy enough to export out of 3D Coat. And polygonal objects are easy to export out of 3D Coat, but so are sub-D objects. But there's one little snag that a lot of people miss, and if they don't do this properly, what winds up happening is the proportions of your object wind up becoming messed up if you use the same mesh cage. If you export out the mesh cage and create a new mesh cage from within inside of 3D Coat, one of the reasons could be is because you created a UV map inside of 3D Coat, so it has to be attached to a new model and exported out. If you already have a UV map, say you modeled this in Lightwave and you already had a UV map on it, you could just export out the textures, the color map, the normal map, the specular map, etc. And that would actually work. But if you created a UV map within, like I said, within 3D Coat, you need to be able to export not just the image maps, you also need to be able to export out a new model file so that you have UV maps or a UV map that the images can be applied to. And in this case here, when I did this project for 3D Coat version 3, photo painting, I actually, from what I remember, I used the 3D Coat's automated UVs. I didn't actually make a traditional UV island style UV map. I just did the auto mapping, and it worked out pretty good. The textures are pretty clean. There's no crazy ugly seams or anything, so it worked out well. But anyways, so if you're exporting sub-D objects, this process is exactly the same for exporting a sub-D object as it is a polygonal object. Like I showed that spaceship earlier, but we'll show the spaceship again in just a second, or in a couple minutes here. So we just go over, we go over under File, and we go to Export Model, okay? And all we have to do is give it a name, okay? We'll just call it Elephant. We're not really going to save this, but I just want to show you the panel that pops up after we click Save, after we give our file a name. Okay, this is the Export panel. This is going to be very, very, very crucial. That's why I want to talk about it now, so that when the time comes, either in this volume or one of the other volumes, that you're going to be aware of this, that this is important. So put this on your checklist. This is a very important, this video clip here is very, very important when you're exporting your models out of 3D Coat. So you can see here it says export mid-poly mesh. We would want that to be, we would want this to be selected as low poly mesh. Now, normally under export displacement, there's something called use source positions. Okay, but it doesn't seem to be in our drop-down list. So the reason for that is you have to have export low poly mesh. All the low poly mesh is the original mesh cage. So in general, most of the time we're not going to, normally I always go with the low poly mesh, just because, I want to keep my original mesh, And it also allows me to access use source positions. Watch how this disappears when I go to mid poly mesh. See how it just disappeared? Now if I go back to low poly, okay, this is so that I don't increase the amount of polygons in my model, and I'm going to go click use source positions. And so this little check mark can either make your day wonderful, or the absence of it can mess your day up if you're using a sub-D object. If you are just exporting out a polygonal object, then you shouldn't really have to worry about this. You shouldn't have to select this. Okay, so let's close this out. Oh, and before I get to that, if we don't have use source position selected, what winds up happening is that the mesh becomes out of whack. The vertices have a tendency, when you save them out, they shift and they move. What that use source positions does, it sort of locks things into place. This particular model, when I did this without using source positions, what happens is, and like I said, this isn't just a rule for this model. This is the same situation that you could get into other models as well. What happens is the legs, they were like shrunken up, and something weird happened with the tusks. Depending on the model, you'll have different problems in different areas. We want to keep that original mesh cage. And what we mean by the original mesh cage, let me hit the tab key. This is the original mesh cage of the object. This is in polygonal mode. When I hit tab, we're in sub-D mode. So what's happening is that when we use that check mark, use source positions, okay, it will save out the vertices in these proper positions. So then that way, when you hit tab, everything's nice and round and smooth, and nothing is out of proportion. So if your object winds up looking skinny in different areas where it wasn't skinny before, you'll know it's because you probably forgot to check use source positions. So let's go new, and let's go under open recent Starfighter. So this will take a couple moments for this to load up. Those of you who have a slow computer, or you have a project that has a lot of geometry and heavy amounts of image maps, it may take a few seconds for 3D Coat to load them in. If it takes 5 or 10 minutes, then you definitely have a problem. Your computer's probably froze. But if for some reason it doesn't load right away, just like I said, take some time and give 3D Coat a few moments to load it up. And so it might not necessarily froze, but if you start clicking on your screen all over the place trying to get something to happen, you might actually crash the software. You may actually, when you first load stuff in, sometimes see software program not responding. Just leave it. Just leave it for a bit. Don't touch your mouse. Just let it go, and it should load up fine. Unless it really has crashed. But like I said, if you get past like 2 or 3 minutes, then you know probably something's definitely wrong. So the same concept here. If I want to export this out, I do the exact same thing. This is a polygonal object. It's not a sub-D object. It's a polygonal object. I go File, and I go Export Model. So the process is exactly the same. I go Spaceship. Okay. And remember, you still have different options of how you can save things out. I usually save stuff out usually as an LWO or an object file, depending on where this is going to be going. If I'm going to Lightwave, I save it out as a Lightwave file. Okay, so let's click Save so we can get to the panel. Notice that Use Source Positions doesn't exist here. If you go up to Low Poly Mesh, Use source positions, once again, does exist, but you shouldn't actually need to use this just for a polygonal object. So, but if something weird did happen and your mesh was all distorted or whatever, you know, you may try clicking on it and seeing if it actually solves the problem, but you shouldn't actually need to use that just for a polygonal mesh that only has one subdivision layer. That's basically what a polygonal mesh is. It just means that there's one level of geometry, and a sub-D object is something that has two or more subdivision levels. I believe Lightwave, the default subdivision when you're working with sub-Ds, the default that comes with the factory setting is I think it's the subdivision level is 3, but you can go higher if you want things to be more round and control your sub patches differently, nicer seams and creases. But anyways, we're not going to get into that at the moment. But anyways, so basically anything over one subdivision level, that means it's a sub-D object. So, but remember, if you're doing sub-D objects, okay, you need to be, in order to access that use source positions, you can't be in mid-poly, because look, it disappears. You need to be in export low poly mesh mode. See how it says export resolution? So basically, low poly mesh, all that means is, once again, your original, let me hit tab, your original mesh cage. Now I can show the exact same thing here in 3D Coat. Let's hit cancel. If we go over to view and I go, see, I click low poly. Silly me. I don't want the spaceship. I want the elephantage. Just give me a second here. It's going to take a moment to load up. Yeah, so I just want to make sure that you understand the whole concept of, the original mesh cage and how to access them also in both pieces of software. So I just showed you how to do it in Lightwave. Once again, it's just hitting the tab key and then you can see the original mesh. So it's all blocky like this. This is the original mesh before you turn it into a sub-D object. And so, like I said, if you hit tab, I believe this is 3 subdivision levels. And it's divided the polygons 3 times, and then it has this spline effect that rounds out your mesh. So let's go back to 3D Coat, and we load up our friend the elephant. Let's center that up. And we'll zoom in on this. And so let's go to under view and let's hit low poly and see how it's all boxy and everything. So this is in polygonal mode. I'm going to go under view again. Let's hit wireframe. So you can see it's the same concept as this. So this is what these meshes here are, what those use source positions is actually saving out. It's keeping the integrity of the positions of all the vertices, the points that create these polygons in UV space. So like I said, very important to get things in and out. If we don't understand what any of this stuff is, if a problem arises, you won't know how to fix it. So anyways, I hope I've stressed that enough so that you can, so that when you're working on your projects and something doesn't look right, this is, like I said, an important part of it. Although this is done, at the end, the use source positions, I wanted to make you aware of it now. We will discuss it down the road, but we probably won't emphasize it so much. The reason why I wanted to talk about it was because we were talking about the difference between polygonal objects, sub-D objects. And so anyways, so what we're going to do is we're going to stop here and we will be back in a moment.